Thank you. So, well, I'm going to talk about this book, Dark Side of the Mirror, Forgetting the Self in Dogen's Genjo Koan. This is the book to which Will just referred, that Carol discovered. It's a book about Dogen's text, Genjo Koan. Dogen Zenj, as founder, generally regarded as the founder of Soto Zen in Japan. I don't think he thought of himself quite in that way, but this is often the case with founding figures or those who are taken to be the founders of tradition, because of course at the time that they lived, the tradition didn't exist. They simply taught what they taught, and others then built upon it. This is the case with Soto Zen. Though at the same time, he was transmitting what he had learned from his own teacher, Ru Jing, in China, which was the Cao Dong tradition in the school of Chan in China, which we take to be the forerunner of Zen. So this is a tradition going a long way back. The Cao Dong tradition was started in the 9th century by a teacher generally called Dong Shan. I might say a little bit more about Dong Shan in a minute. Dogen, therefore, very important character in the history of this tradition. And he wrote quite a number of works. And his masterwork was going to be a text of 100 chapters called the Shobogenzo. Unfortunately, Dogen died at the age of 53 before he had had a chance to finish this great work. And he was, in fact, in the process of revising the chapters, 85 or so of them, that he had already written at the time when he died. So we don't know exactly what the Shobogenzo would have looked like had he lived another 10 years or so. But nonetheless, it is generally regarded as a great religious classic. And Genjo Koan was intended to be the first chapter of this book. And although, as I say, Dogen was in the process of revising, as far as scholars can work out, he had done his revising of Genjo Koan and hardly changed a word. Now, Genjo Koan had been written several decades earlier. And so this tells us that there was a certain consistency in Dogen's thinking. So at the very end of his life, he was still committed to the ideas that he expressed in Genjo Koan. So Genjo Koan, therefore, is a very important text, intended to be the first chapter in the Shobogenzo, the most important work of the most important writer in the tradition. And consequently, many people have translated it and written commentaries on it. And my own teacher, Kenneth Roshi, regarded it very highly. She often spoke of Genjo Koan as one of the really important texts of Dogen. And we her disciples would all read it and be more and more mystified. Well, some aspects of it are clear, but in many translations, it's not at all an easy text to understand. And you can go on the internet and you can find quite a few translations. and you can compare them. And I have done this very thing, and also bought books about it and studied it and reflected on it. And so, in a sense, this work is the result of about 40 years of reflection on the text and my own struggles and puzzlement and what does it mean. Very often when you read commentaries on Genjo Koan, the author uses it as a sort of platform on which to advance many good, sound ideas about Buddhist practice, Buddhist training, especially, of course, Zen training and Zen practice. But then comes out like a list of different things. This practice, that practice, the other practice, this idea, that idea, the other idea. And there isn't kind of cohesion. So as Will mentioned, actually, one of my objectives in producing the book was to get some cohesion, to see what is the central thread, what is the real meaning of this text. And the text itself includes many figures which you can take as metaphors in a sense, though often they don't really work as metaphors, but they produce images in which Dogen tries to advance his idea. And of course, the central idea is the idea of the mirror. And if you know about Buddhism and Zen, you probably have heard the term the mirror mind a number of times. And I said that the tradition goes back to Dogen in the 9th century in China. And Dogen was a disciple of Yunyan. And it apparently, we learn is that one of the major things that Yunyan taught and transmitted to Dogen was the famous text, the most excellent mirror samadhi, or the jewel mirror samadhi, it is sometimes called, which again, there are a number of translations of this text. It begins in my own teacher's translation. The white snow falls upon the silver plate. The snowy heron in the bright moon hides. Resembles each the other, yet these two are not the same. Combining them, we can distinguish one from other. Supreme mind in words can never be expressed. And yet, to all the trainee's needs, it does respond. And it goes on in this vein. And there are many excellent teachings wrapped up in this text, the jewel mirror. But you can see even from those initial lines that it is saying something about how things aren't always what they seem. And the snowy heron, the bright moon, they're both white, but they're not the same. And so on. And Dogen was looking for, I think, this deeper meaning. And when he thought about the mirror image, he very interestingly turned the mirror around, as it were. When we think of the mirror and the mirror mind, we tend to be most interested in the bright side of the mirror. We want to be like a bright mirror. You perhaps know also the little poems in the Platform Sutra of Hui Neng, in which the first poem is about keeping your mirror shining and bright. And Hui Neng responds that there never was a mirror and so on, but that's another story. But the idea of keeping your mirror bright is one way of thinking about spiritual training, spiritual practice, you make great effort to keep your mirror bright. And the mirror stays bright because you polish it. So you work hard and you get your mirror bright and shiny. But Dogen points out that the mirror only exists because the other side of the glass, say, is dark, is black. If you take a piece of glass, you paint one side black, the other side becomes a mirror. So if you want to become a mirror, if you want a mirror mind, then this is the way to make your mirror. Of course, you might polish it afterwards, but that's kind of secondary. You have to make the mirror first. And so Dogen built up his idea around this, of the darkening of one side of the glass, as it were. And this can be by making one side of the mirror with black paint, as you might say. But in nature, this happens through a change in the light. If you are standing by a pool of water, you look into the water, you can see perhaps the rocks and the fishes. You can see into the water. The water, if it's good water, is transparent, and you can see deep into the water. And then there might be some change in the light. And at a certain point, as you might say, a tipping point is crossed. And suddenly, where you are looking, you can no longer see fish and you can no longer see rocks on the bottom. Suddenly, what you can see is the sky. And classically, in the use of this image in Buddhism, and Dogen's not alone in using this image, what you see is the moon, because the scene is usually set in the night time. Nighttime, of course, represents the state of delusion. We're all in the dark. But at a certain point, the water reflects the moon, and the moon represents the Dharma. And this happens quite suddenly, and it doesn't happen through one's own effort. One doesn't polish the surface of the water. One doesn't, in fact, do anything except observe and be still and receive what appears. So Dogen uses this image. And so Genjo Koan is about the nature of this phenomenon in ourselves. So we can say Genjo Koan is about Satori. It's about the nature of enlightenment. Genjo means appearance, sudden appearance, something suddenly appearing, like the moon suddenly appears in the water. And he has also a special meaning for the word koan, which I perhaps will get to if I have time. So we have to perhaps put all this into a little bit of context. Dogen lived in the 13th century. He was born in 1200. And he had what we would conventionally regard as a tragic childhood. His father died when he was 2. His mother died when he was 8 years old. According to another story, the person who was his legal father was not his natural father. He was, according to this other story, he was an illegitimate child of another man who never recognized him. Either way, it was a pretty rum scene. And it is said that at the age of 8, while watching the incense smoke rise over his mother's coffin, he resolved to become a monk. And you can see this in the terms of realizing impermanence. Nothing impresses impermanence upon you so much as losing your loved ones. And so this in due course happened. He in due course went off to a monastery and finished up at Mount Hiei, which was the great monastery. And he trained as a Tendai monk at Mount Hiei. And at Hiei, the main teacher, the sort of fundamental teaching, was the teaching of original enlightenment, inherent enlightenment, that everybody has Buddha nature and they just have to realize their Buddha nature. And Dogen found that this teaching rather niggled him. You might say it was his koan in a certain way, at least the way it was presented, because it seemed to him to imply that no effort was necessary, really, and that all could easily be well. But he was suffering, and he didn't know how to put these teachings and facts and so on together. And one of his teachers said, perhaps you're a vigorous young man with lots of energy. You should go and study Zen. So at this time there was an offshoot of Hiei, which had been founded by Isai, which was a Rinzai Zen temple. And Rinzai was not a separate school in those days. It was just a subsection of the Tendai school. So it was part of the Hiei setup, and Dogen went there. And he studied with Isai's successor, Myozen. And the teacher who'd sent him there had also said, and if you get a chance, go to China. That's where all the best teaching comes from. And one day Myozen said that he was planning to go to China himself. And so Dogen, please, can I come? Can I come? And Myozen decided he would take Dogen along as his jisha, as his assistant. And they went on the boat, long journey, bit of a difficult journey, but they made it to China. And they arrived in China, and immediately Myozen was recognized as the Buddhist teacher that he was, and went off to the big monastery. And Dogen was all ready to go with him, but they said, no, you're not a proper monk. You haven't taken the right precepts at the right time, and so on. And so Dogen was left isolated in the port with no status. It must have been very difficult. He started writing letters to the government, to the emperor, to have his status reviewed and so on. Had to wait ages for replies. There was no internet in those days. You couldn't dash off a few emails. It's a very difficult business. And the replies always came back in the negative. And so this was defeat. And being defeated is quite an important part of Dogen's thinking, Dogen's experience. He didn't waste this time. He spent the time visiting various monasteries and making friends with monks when he could. And he learned a lot during this time. Some of you may have read Tenzo Kyokan, the instructions to the cook, for instance, and other texts by Dogen, which describe how a Zen monastery, a Buddhist monastery, is run down to very fine detail. And much of this is information that he gathered at that time when he was, in a certain sense, a tourist, but a very percipient one, studying everything that he could, gathering information. Eventually, he was more or less in despair of ever getting into the monastery, and he was getting ready to go back to Japan. when the abbot of the monastery died, and they chose a new abbot. And the new abbot, Ru Jing, was a somewhat unconventional character. And Dogen thought, well, it might be worth one last chance. So he went and knocked on the door of the monastery and told his story. And Ru Jing took pity on him and said, well, I can't overturn what the government says, what the emperor says. So I can't treat you as a monk. You'll have to enter as a layperson. But I'll let you in. You can come into the monastery and you can practice. And you can come and hear the taisho, the talks, and you can have. And Ru Jing obviously developed a soft spot for Dogen, and allowed him to come to meetings that lay people wouldn't normally be allowed to come to, and to ask questions and to enter into the discussion and debate and so on. And so I think there's a second element here. So firstly, we have an element of Dogen being humiliated. His status as a monk, all the training he'd done in Japan and so on, counted for nothing. And he was reduced to being a lay person in the monastery. And yet, on the other hand, Ru Jing took pity on him, had a soft spot for him, loved him, took care of him. So this was somebody who as a little boy had lost both his parents. So we have a sort of chemical reaction here, if you like, between, on the one hand, the loss, the humiliation, and on the other hand, the lifting up, the caring. And this juxtaposition of hot and cold, as it were, I think very important. Anyway, Dogen had gone to China to improve himself, to find the solution to his own problem, to his own suffering. This is not unlike the story of Shakyamuni Buddha, who left home looking for the solution to his own problem. One day, Dogen is sitting in the meditation hall, and the monk next to him is in the meditation hall has fallen asleep. You get up very early in these monasteries, and you're meditating at 4 or 5 a.m. Sometimes you get quite drowsy. Anyway, Ru Jing comes along and reprimands this monk and says, what is the point of you sitting here sleeping? The whole point here is to let body and mind fall away. And this expression, body and mind fall away, somehow struck Dogen, and he had a great awakening experience as a result of this, and he went to see Ru Jing and talked about it. And this again is a little bit like Shakyamuni Buddha. Shakyamuni Buddha went through hell, ascetic practice of extremity, searching for the solution to his own problem. But then he had an awakening which led to a life in which he was no longer chasing after his own problem. He was busy helping many, many other people. Dogen's the same. After this encounter, he felt very differently about the whole business of practice and so on. Shortly afterwards, Ru Jing, the teacher in China, died, and Dogen returned to Japan. But he now had a great enthusiasm for bringing the Dharma to other people. And one of the earliest things that he wrote was Genjo Koan, And he wrote Genjo Koan, we think, for a lay follower. And this was a way of explaining the nature of Satori, the nature of enlightenment. Now, of course, I said earlier, we like the bright side of the mirror, and Dogen talks about how the important thing is the dark side. Well, I think the important thing when Dogen reflected was the dark side in his own life, the loss of his parents, the humiliation he had experienced in China. These were the things from which he learned most. We learn most from our failures. We learn most from our defeats. And when we have a great defeat of one sort or another, then it can be make or break. It can make our life a ruin, or it can make us wake up, make us realize something that we never really realized before. We start to take life seriously in a new way. So there is something of this here. Dogen uses quite a number of other figures in the Genjo Koan text. He extends the idea of the mirror in a very classic Buddhist image of that even a dewdrop can function as a mirror. When it is dark, the dewdrop also reflects the moon. And as he says, even the smallest dewdrop can reflect the whole moon. It doesn't matter how big the dewdrop is. The whole moon, in fact, the whole sky is reflected in the dewdrop. It's not like each dewdrop gets its share of the moon. Each dewdrop gets the whole moon. And Dogen also says the distance between the moon and the dewdrop, the greater the distance, the deeper the reflection will be. You don't need to worry too much about the physics of all this, but the meaning of it is that, we are the dewdrops. So, however small or humble or inadequate or whatever one may be, one can still be a reflection of the whole moon. The whole Dharma can reflect in any of us. And in fact, the greater the distance, the more humble, the more lowly the person is, the deeper will be the reflection. So this is one of the figures in Genjo Koan. Many of the figures that he uses are not they don't appeal to us intuitively with our modern mind the way Dogen means them. The modern person might well think, well, isn't it better for the water to be transparent than to just reflect? We want to be transparent, we want to be open and so on. But no, Dogen says the state of Satori is the state of reflection. I could say more about that. Another occasion, he talks about the difference between being in the state of Satori and the state of not being in Satori is as different as life and death. What he means is Satori is the state of death and not Satori is the state of life. We would normally take these images the other way round. He talks about firewood and ash. Ash is the enlightened state. Firewood is the state which is inflammable. A match could set it off and all sorts of trouble could result. Whereas the ash cannot do that. So there are many images here. I haven't time to go into in depth the different images that he uses. But there is a certain, but to me, by the time I had finished studying all this, there was a cohesion to the whole matter. It's not that each of these images, birds and fish, firewood and ash, life and death, the mirror before and after, the tipping point. It's not that these are each saying something different which relates to some different aspect of Buddhist teaching or some different practice. They all really are aspects of the same thing. They're all about the fact that the Satori occurs abruptly. It's a matter of there being a tipping point. And it occurs through a darkening, a humbling experience, which nonetheless is accompanied by light. Just as his own experience, he had been humiliated, but there was light in the eyes of Ru Jing, who came and took care of him. And so these two things go together. And so in general, what my experience is that people have spiritual awakenings, be they big or be they small, but they tend to have spiritual awakenings in this kind of circumstance where some sort of defeat and some sort of inspiration occur at the same time. Again, we can see this in the story of Shakyamuni Buddha and the four sights. He sees the three sights of old age, death, illness. This is the defeat, if you like. But then he sees the inspiration, the sadhu. When these things come together, then there can be some new chemistry, something new happens. But we shouldn't go too far with this, because one of the things that Dogen is also kind of implying is that there isn't any method. When we want to study these things, often we're studying with the mind of, well, if I can just understand this, then I'll understand the right practice and I'll understand how to set up the right conditions, and then I'll get the result. But Dogen's saying, if your result is dependent on conditions, or if your result is dependent upon some practice that you have contrived, that is not enlightenment, because enlightenment by definition is to be beyond conditions. And so although your practice may have some intrinsic benefit, you may become a better person, this will not constitute satori. This will not constitute real enlightenment. Real enlightenment is something that happens just as when you stand on the edge of that lake and the evening gathers and the light changes and suddenly the effect changes. And so in a certain way, it's an accident, just like Dogen did not contrive to have Ru Jing come up and reprimand the monk next to him. But nonetheless, Dogen did put himself in a position where something of that kind might happen. So there are many kinds of paradoxes, you might call them, but they're not really so much paradoxes. That's just an illustration of the fact that we have a grasping mind. We want to get something, and this is largely what gets in the way. Dogen went to China wanting to get something for his body and mind, and hearing the words, "Let it go." In his case, he was ripe to hear those words in a new way. Sometimes, of course, we've heard the necessary thing many times, but although we have heard it in one sense, we haven't heard it. We haven't taken it in. This is the nature of much of Buddhism. It's all there in the sutras. It's all there in every discourse you hear. but we don't necessarily take it in. So this is a bit about Dogen, a bit about Genjo Koan, and I studied it for many years, and eventually I had accumulated enough stuff to think that it might make a book. And I put it all together, and this is the result. And one of the things I like about having produced this book is that it's a cooperation, because here am I as a Pure Land Buddhist writing about a Zen Buddhist, and the book was published by the Triratna organization, which is from a third school of Buddhism. And this kind of cooperation between Buddhist groups is also, I think, an excellent thing. Now, I could go on for ages, but I think it might be better if I take questions from you, and we'll see what direction we go in. We might go off in some tangent completely. I really don't mind in what direction you take things. We can see. It doesn't have to be totally on topic. Do you want to say anything at this point, Will?